For our final recording here with Chapter 10, we're going to wrap up our discussion about genetics, talk a little bit about reaction ranges, and then get back to sort of intelligence-specific stuff. As I said in the last one, that section was a lot of information and a lot of concepts that are going to apply across much more than just intelligence. And our discussion at the beginning here is going to be the same. So the idea that genes are not something deterministic applies across all of the different traits that we can talk about. So you want to remember, genes are not destiny. A lot of times people will say, oh, you have the gene for X. And then you interpret that as you are going to have X or you are going to display X. But even like when we were talking about the example of having brown hair, you might have genes that get you to produce brown pigment that would make you have brown hair, but the environment can influence that. Having none of the amino acids that you need to be able to produce that particular protein can change the appearance of your hair. Being in an environment where maybe you have tons of sun exposure that bleaches all the pigment, you have lighter hair, there's always going to be the potential for the environment to influence things. And while a lot of the short forms when we're talking about different genes is, oh, you have the gene for X, it's actually more accurate to say that this is a gene that contributes to the expression of trait X, but any one gene is not going to determine that you have this thing or not. And when I say that there are very, very few genes that are deterministic, I mean that I can think of a single gene that is deterministic within different diagnoses. And this is specifically Huntington's disease, where there is a specific gene for this Huntington gene, where if you have a certain version of that gene, then you will develop the disorder later in life. But that is the only example that I know of, even having taught a whole bunch of genes and psychology and behavior stuff. So most of our genes, when we have something that's related with a particular trait, we're just saying that this is something that maybe increases your likelihood of developing a trait. It gives you a genetic predisposition towards a trait, but the environment is always going to play a role. And sometimes your environment can end up playing a protective role. So you might have a genetic predisposition towards a particular diagnosis, but if you're in an environment that helps reduce those risks, then you are less likely to have that particular diagnosis in your future. So genes themselves are not necessarily going to tell us that you have a disorder or not. For the most part, it's just going to tell us this is our relative contribution. The environment is going to play a role, and we actually have to look at the interaction between the two and all of that combined in order to sort of see what we get in the end. So this is just sort of a pause of genes aren't deterministic. Don't panic with some of the terminology with genetics. Having a gene that's related to X does not mean that you automatically have X. All right, so what does that look like in practice? One of the concepts related to this is something called a reaction range. Now, a reaction range basically says that our genes are going to set out a range of possibilities. So we have a predisposition. We're going to be in this ballpark. So we inherit a range of potential expression. So our genes, our genotype, sets up a bunch of different possible phenotypes. And then the environment is going to say, all right, within our genetic limitations, our genetic predispositions, where actually does this individual fall for a particular trait? So the environment is going to decide sort of where in that range we're going to see you in terms of your total phenotype. And it's kind of weird to say in words. So I have this diagram here where we're going to look at, say at the top here, we'll look at down here in a moment, but this one here, we're seeing that this purple bar in the background is going to be our genetically determined, though influenced is probably a better term, our genetically influenced reaction range. So this individual might have an IQ as high as here or as low as here. And then their environment is going to say, all right, in this range, where is this person going to fall? Because they're very low within that range, that kind of gives us a hint that they might be in a fairly deprived or non-boosting environment. And in fact, at the bottom here, we can see some examples that looks to be this individual here maybe. But we have three different kinds of environments. So when we're looking at intellectual growth in terms of these environments, this would be something like, well, average would be like you're at a normal school. Enriched would be maybe you're at a school that has specialized programs that are supposed to help encourage learning and creative thinking and flexibility in problem solving. And then deprived would be maybe you're in an area where there's no funding and the schools are not so great and you don't get a lot of practice using your cognitive abilities. In these cases, being in a deprived environment is going to say that within the range set out by your genes, we tend to fall fairly low in that range because the environment is making our likelihood of having high intelligence worse. If we're in a better environment, an enriched environment, we're more likely to fall on the upper end of that reaction range. Now, of course, you're going to find there are some individuals here that fall higher or lower. There's always going to be individual variation, but we're looking that within enriched environments, we tend to fall sort of higher on that spectrum. And in the poor environments, the deprived environments will fall lower on that spectrum. And that's a pretty common pattern to observe. So this is showing that idea that, yeah, genes can give us sort of this predisposition, this range that's likely, and then the environment will influence that and determine where within it we're going to fall. Now, some of you may have noticed, though, that while we've been talking about our genes and our environment are going to contribute to the phenotype, to the trait that we observe, and we've talked about, having identical genes versus having a shared environment. When we were looking at, say, some of these diagrams back here, well, you might have noticed that our identical twins, which we've said share 100% of their genes, and here they shared their environment, so perfectly shared genes, shared environment, should they not have identical expression of a trait? While yes, 0.86 is a very, very high score, that's still not explaining everything. So what else could it be? If it's not genes and it's not our shared environment, what else is there? And that's where we get into sort of this breakdown here. So our shared environment is when we're talking about environmental factors that are going to be consistent when you're raised in a home together. So this would be like with our identical twins, they probably have either the same bedroom or similar bedrooms. They're going to probably go to the same schools. They're probably going to have same access to, say, the library or whatever it is we're interested in. So there are certain factors that they share. But of course, even with identical twins, they are different individuals. They're going to have things in their environment that aren't shared. So non-shared environment actually starts considering things that they would differ in. Maybe they have different friends groups. Maybe they have different hobbies. Maybe one likes certain types of sports and the other is more of a music person. In those cases, we're going to have small differences where they are different individuals. And we call this our non-shared environment. And when we start calculating things like our heritability coefficients and all of that, this is typically considered basically an error term. So when we run the calculations in the background, we talk about this much is explained by genetics, about this much is explained by shared environment, and here's what's left over. And that must be due to these things that they don't share in their environment. So if you've noticed the fact that, yes, we can say this much looks like it's related to environment and this much looks like it's related to genes, there's always going to be more to it than that. So our technical term is we call it non-shared environment. It catches all the stuff that's left over, and then we kind of ignore it from that point forward. But I figured I'd include that since that is one of our conventions when talking about our relative contributions. Because even though we say phenotype is genes and environment, there's a little bit more to it than that. All right, so that has been a lot of stuff that, as I said, was not specific to intelligence. It is all applicable to intelligence and our understanding of what things contribute to intelligence, especially when looking at things like our heritability and genetic contributions of intelligence. But there's also other things that we want to consider. Though now that I'm thinking about it, before we start talking about how age can influence our heritability coefficients across time, we should probably actually look at some of the values that we were talking about before, because I ended up focusing on these specifically in terms of how do we know that there's a genetic contribution versus an environmental contribution. But I didn't actually talk about what this meant in terms of intelligence. I got very focused on the fact that we're talking about our heritability scores or our correlations over here and what that means and how we know genes versus environment, but we didn't talk about the numbers. So this diagram is all about intelligence test scores. So this is something like if we're looking at identical twin A's IQ test versus identical twin B's IQ score, well, we're going to find that the two tend to be very close together. So if we have, in this case, a massive sample, this is such a good study where they have almost 5,000 pairs of twins, which is huge. And they say, all right, based on what we have for one twin score, how much does that tell us about the other twin score? 0.6 or 0.86 is very high. This means that if twin A scores high, twin B is very likely to also score high. And even when we see that they're raised apart, so identical twins without a shared environment, still almost 0.8. So twin A scoring high means that twin B likely scores high too, even if they didn't share an environment. So that tells us there's definitely a shared genetic component here. And if we start looking at actual heritability scores for intelligence overall, we're typically going to find them in the range for about 0.5 to 0.7. The reason why, so here we're looking at these correlations for these specific types of individuals. When we calculate an overall heritability coefficient, we're looking at sort of a number that allows us to look at the big picture. So we don't care about specific sort of identical twins only or fraternal twins only or any of that. Heritability coefficients are giving us the idea of the population as a whole. So while we interpret the numbers similarly, we're calculating them very differently. But those heritability coefficients for intelligence tend to be fairly high, where 50% or more of the variation in intelligence within a given population tends to be like more than 50%. So that tells us that, yeah, genes are probably going to have a strong influence on the variation in intelligence. Now, this being said, we don't actually have specific genes that we can look at and say, ah, yes, people who have this version of this gene are more intelligent than people who don't have that gene. We just sort of talk about general genetic relatedness rather than a particular gene, which is fairly common for psychological studies. But yeah, just sort of a point and a little bit of a backtrack to explain what this means and what the overall heritability would be, and why we then know that intelligence does have that genetic component. All right, now back to where we were before I realized I missed something. This is looking at age and intelligence and the fact that when we start quantifying heritability, it actually increases as we start looking at individuals who are older. So when we look at, say, toddlers getting into the 3, 4, 5 years of age range, here we're saying the percentage of IQ differences between people attributable to genetic differences. This is going to be our heritability, basically. So this would be like 0.1, 0.2. So 0.3 or less explained by genetic differences, that's a pretty low value. So this is saying that our environment probably has a pretty large role when we're very young. As we get older though, so into 65 and higher, we're seeing that these values are in the range of like 0.8, 0.9 sometimes, which says that a lot of this is going to be due to genetics. And some of this, if we logically think about it, when we're looking at children, they tend to be in fairly different environments. So before we enter into school, your environment is entirely your home life. Then as we get into school, yeah, we're going to have some more similarities in terms of environment, So variation that we'd observe in that population is probably more due to our individual, say, biological components, much less due to the shared environment. And as we get older and older, maybe the environment gets more similar. That one I don't have a great story for up here, but it does make sense that at the bottom, before we're in school, our home environments are very, very different from one another, and therefore that's probably going to influence a lot more of our variation. And then as we get older, the genes are probably going to have a larger relative contribution, maybe because the environments are getting more similar. Think back to our sort of thought exercises talking about heritability coefficients and the fact that changing the environment can end up changing that heritability coefficient simply because of the proportional contributions. So if the environment contributes more, genes have to contribute less. So use that in your interpretation here. We have also talked about the fact that as we get older, we do see that our intelligence scores tend to decline. In the development chapter, we talked about the fact that, yeah, once we hit around sort of the 45, 50, 60 mark, we start seeing that gradual decline in intelligence. And while this one here is just looking at a total IQ score using one of our standardized tests, the WAIS, this maybe doesn't differentiate between things like our um, crystallized intelligence versus our fluid intelligence. Those are the terms. So we might see that there'd be variation if we break it up into crystallized versus fluid intelligence, but we do see sort of a general trend of decline with age. And if we focus on the fact that, like before, we said that fluid intelligence tends to decline most rapidly, that kind of makes sense. As we get older, we tend to have, say, fewer connections in our brains. We will start seeing things like deterioration in terms of loss of brain mass as we get older. In some of the extremes, by the time you hit about 90 years of age, you can actually find almost a 10% decrease in brain volumes in some studies. Now, that seems really intimidating and scary and sort of, again, deterministic. But as we've said before, the environment can end up being a very protective force where if we have individuals who, even into old age, spend a lot of time, say, interacting with others, they do their crossword, they travel, they have lots of friends, having those things stimulating their brains even as they get older can actually be very protective and can mitigate a lot of that potential for deterioration across time. And we'll find that that deterioration being mitigated means that these scores don't decline quite as quickly. But you will usually find that as people start retiring and their environments get less and less stimulating, that tends to reflect sort of some of these decreases in intelligence as well as sort of reductions in functioning. And so if that's mainly focusing on sort of declines with speed and flexibility and thinking, and showing that sort of deterioration as we get older, if we look at the other thing, if we look at our crystallized intelligence and look at, say, learning from experience, that tends not to decline as rapidly. And if we start looking at things like vocabulary and general knowledge, those scores are going to stay pretty consistent all the way up until your 70s or so. And that's simply because we have more of an accumulation of information as we get older. We're going to learn more words, we're going to have more experiences, things like that. So that crystallized intelligence stays pretty high until we get older and start seeing more of those cognitive deficits. So that decline ends up being sort of pushed off simply because we've accumulated more experience. That crystallized intelligence stays high. And again, all of these sorts of graphs are going to change dramatically depending on which types of ways we're quantifying intelligence. So this is the WAIS and a single IQ score. But if we had one of our, say, intelligence tests that breaks down multiple different subtypes of intelligence, we might end up with very different curves depending on which aspect we're looking at. Because normally the research focuses on just an IQ score to keep it simple, there's a lot more complexity if you dig deeper. I've mentioned a few times before that when we're looking at an IQ test, these tests have actually been standardized. What that means is that all of the calculations that they're doing behind the scenes have been set up in a controlled way so that when you conduct an intelligence test on any one population, the average of that population is going to be 100. So this is kind of interesting because if you're designing a new intelligence test, well, you're going to have an average be 100 always. So when you're coming in, you're designing a test specifically with this in mind. It's actually even more than that. It's not just having a score of 100 as your average, but we actually end up with a standardized curve that has a known distribution. So again, sort of the behind the scenes, how they crunch all of the different scores is set up so that we get this really nice curve here that's going to show that average of 100. And then we're going to have about 34% of the population is going to fall between 85 and 100. About 34% will fall between 100 and 115, and so on and so forth. So all of these different breakdowns are going to show sort of the yellow in the middle is the mainly average individuals within that population. We then have sort of people who are below that average and above that average, and then we get into more extremes. Now, our textbook spends a lot of time talking about sort of the very upper extremes at opposite ends of the spectrum, showing sort of people with the highest IQ scores and people with the lowest IQ scores. However, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about what we care the most about is the fact that we have this normalized distribution and that you're going to have this standardization occur for each new test as it's devised, and it's going to apply to the population in which it's intended to be employed. Now, you might start seeing some issues with this because, of course, we're going to have things like differences within that population over time might have an impact. And we'll actually see something called the Flynn effect in a moment. But if we're using the same test and we are not re-standardizing that test, we're not sort of making adjustments to keep that mean at 100, well, then you can actually start seeing some of that drift. So I'm going to hop ahead. I actually should have put this slide first. But the Flynn effect is a product of the fact that you don't keep re-standardizing tests every single year. We'll often keep a test once it's been created and standardized and then sort of use that as our standard. But the population changes over time. So this is something really weird. This is an accidental finding, but we found that intelligence test scores tend to rise by about 0.3% every year. So James Flynn discovered this many, many years ago and started noticing that we actually have this sort of upward trend. So if we look at crystallized versus fluid IQ, regardless of the type, we're still seeing this upward trending. So from, say, the 1910 here all the way up to 2010, over the course of 100 years, we're actually seeing a 20-point change in the average IQ for our population. That's a massive increase. Now, we might look at this and say, all right, well, people are just getting smarter. You might be inclined to say, well, this is evolution in action. But I can tell you that evolution and natural selection do not occur in sort of this rapid of a situation. This is across just a couple of generations, and that's a massive change. So there must be something else going on. And there are tons and tons of different proposed explanations here. Some of them can be things like the environment. So things like education. We've had massive improvements in education. We've had standardized education, public education. People get a lot more schooling nowadays than they did back in 1910. So we can see that improvements in education can lead to improvements in performance on standard IQ tests, especially for those styles of tests that end up making use of some of the stuff that gets taught in schools. So a lot of logic and learning and problem solving is taught in a school setting. So more school means better performance on those questions within the tests. We've also had massive improvements in quality of life, things like availability of food and nutritious food where we don't have deficits in our diets. We also have massive improvements in medical care and the availability of medical care. And in those cases, if individuals are growing up in an environment where they have lots of food and they're going to be growing up in a safe environment, well, their brains are going to grow and develop a lot better. If we're in enriched environments, we're going to have that sort of leaning towards sort of higher IQ scores, as we saw with our reaction range discussion. We've also had things like increases in the complexity of our social and technological environment. So again, learning through experience here, but talking about things like interconnectivity between groups. Well, maybe you have different people who can help you learn different ways of thinking because of things like the internet. I know that within even teaching classes, I often end up linking to other people's YouTube videos to say, hey, if my way of teaching didn't work for you, maybe their slight different way of thinking might work for you instead. So there's all sorts of complexity there. And using sort of more complex skills and problem solving and things like that, we actually see that that's going to make you more flexible in your thinking, which is pretty important. And if we look at our diagram here, that fluid IQ is what's increasing most rapidly. So having that flexibility in problem solving, because we've done a lot of problem solving, you probably have done a lot of technological troubleshooting, I'm sure. That helps explain, especially in more recent years, why that might be the case. And I'm sure that you can tell that there are tons and tons of other things that people have used to explain why we see this trend. So while we do, yes, have that sort of steady increase, and it is a pattern that's observed across multiple different types of intelligence tests, we don't want to just take it at face value and say that humans are getting smarter, and that's all. We're having a lot more to it, including the fact that standardized tests might not be changing, but we also have all sorts of environmental factors, social factors, and more. So keeping all of those in mind. Now, I do want to come back here to this slide, which probably should have been moved ahead. But I'm going to talk about a couple of other weird quirks that we'll sometimes see when we're looking at intelligence. And this one here, called the self-enhancement bias, I just find it entertaining, because this is our tendency to judge your own performance as better than average, even if we don't have any evidence that would tell us that that's what's happened. So my favorite way to do this is they'll have people go out and interview people in a random place. So maybe go to an airport and you're going to ask people, are you smarter than average? And of course, because we know that we have our normal distribution and people are going to be sort of 100% on average, we should get 50% of people saying that they're smarter than average and 50% that they're not. But instead, we get that about 80% of people will say that they are above average, which is entertaining. It doesn't just hold for intelligence, this holds for a lot of different things. People tend to assume that they're a lot better at accomplishing different tasks, that they have more skills than they actually do have. Another sort of neat thing to talk about is, actually, I think it's going to end up being a little bit later again. Oh, okay, much, much later. Okay, I'm going to have to move my slides around for next time, but we're going to keep going with just the slide order. We'll come back to another one of those quirks when we get to talk about stereotype threat. They're not directly related. I just thought I was going to have them all together to talk about in one place, but apparently I did not. If you want to continue, though, and talk about something completely different, we can talk about socioeconomic status and intelligence. This is something that gets brought up multiple times because we typically find that if we account for socioeconomic status, whether we're looking at intelligence or a whole bunch of other types of metrics, this is something that has a very strong predictive ability with a lot of those different psychological concepts. And with intelligence, this is kind of easy to explain. So if socioeconomic status, or SES, is one of our best predictors of intelligence, you can probably figure out that it's going to come from the fact that having high socioeconomic status means that you have more money, which means you have more access to more resources. So you're usually able to have a home, possibly a home with more than one parent, because having more people with an income can lead to higher socioeconomic status. And that usually means that you have more interactions, parents and children. You'll also, when you have more money, usually have more availability for things like, say, computers or books, even video games. Things that are intellectually stimulating are just easier at hand because of those finances. You also probably live in a better neighborhood that has more access to things like libraries, also has better schools, so you get a better education. So all of those things are going to tie to this high socioeconomic status, But we also know that things like living in an enriched environment and having good schooling are also going to correlate with high intelligence scores. So if we account for socioeconomic status, that kind of helps explain why some of these different relationships exist. And then, of course, if we focused on high socioeconomic status, we would know that low socioeconomic status, not having lots of funds available, ends up sort of tying to things like brain development issues. This is stuff like it can be, say, malnutrition, but it can also be things like forming fewer connections due to lack of intellectual stimulation, especially early on. So if you don't have lots of access to books and toys and good school, you're not going to be forming the same kinds of connections. These patterns are massive and are observed across all sorts of different relationships. But we figured, or I figured, we'd mention it here with intelligence because that is one of the strongest predictors. So we need to consider that in the background. And then, of course, that then ties itself to the fact that education and intelligence also correlate. So formal education and intelligence scores, depending on the study and depending on how they're quantifying it, we're going to see these correlations between sort of 0.55 to 0.90. Those are fairly strong positive correlations. And again, we've said this before, we have multiple things that can be going on here. So something like smarter people tend to stay in school for longer because they maybe enjoy that setting. They also we're also then going to have the fact that being in school for longer makes people smarter. So there's a little bit of a vicious cycle there. So if you are already smart, then you go to school and stay in school longer. And as you do more schooling, you get more smarts and it feeds into it. Um, this, of course, also ties back to that discussion about socioeconomic status, where having access to education is something that can be sort of facilitated through wealth. But also things like if you have the money to continue your education, you then have more time in school, which leads to that accumulation of smarts. And one of the things to note, though, is that with education, yes, we do see that you are learning sort of critical information, we get some of that crystallized intelligence. You learn facts and figures, you learn dates and connections between things, and that's something that gives you a boost while you're in school. But if you're anything like me, when you don't need to know information for, say, a test, it tends not to stick with you as long. So that boost to our intelligence through that sort of crystallized, I know information kind of intelligence, that tends not to last as long. But we do also find that schools teach things like problem solving, pattern recognition, how to logic. And those types of skills, that flexibility in thinking, tends to last much, much longer. And it then influences how we interact with other information elsewhere. So if you've been in an environment where it's actually, I enjoy acquiring knowledge, I enjoy using this knowledge, you might then also be more likely to keep learning in the future. So again, these things sort of interact and stack as well, which is sort of important to note. And if we're just summing it up with this last sentence here, that ability to sort of think more creatively and things like that, it could also just be the fact that the way that knowledge is tested in school is fairly similar to the structure of a lot of intelligence tests. So by getting really good at taking tests because of your schooling, you might also sort of facilitate your sort of test taking in that IQ test setting as well. So it might be more of a you learn to recognize the patterns and how to respond to questions rather than having sort of general cognitive ability. Again, lots and lots of things that could be going on. So we figured we'd note that too. Next, we're going to look at sex differences in cognitive abilities. I will give a really quick disclaimer here that depending on the studies that you look at, there's a lot of variation in how they divvy up sort of which sex is better at which types of tasks. So I'm going with sort of some broad stroke stuff using a figure from a previous textbook, but I will just make that note that the interpretations and the sort of differences in patterns will change dramatically over the years just because of different ways that we test things and stuff like that. So just getting that out of the way because I know that this is a really interesting topic and it's very widely studied, but it also produces a lot of varied results. So when we're looking at sort of sex differences, women versus men, so we see that women tend to perform better in terms of perceptual speed. So when we're looking at things like find the differences between these images as quickly as possible, they tend to be able to perform those tasks faster than men. They also tend to do really well with language stuff. So verbal fluency, things like down here, you can come up with as many words starting with L and this many letters long. They tend to outperform men for those tasks as well. For men, we tend to see that they perform better on spatial tasks. This can also include things like throwing darts and stuff where you have to interact with your environment, and it's still spatial, but it's also sort of your knowledge of your own body and your movements and controlling those. This is something that I have a little bit more experience with actually from my own field, where when you start looking at sort of navigation and cognition behind navigating in environments, they do often find sex differences there. So if you think of the problem solving involved in moving through a three-dimensional environment, we'll actually find that men tend to use certain types of cues and women tend to use different types of cues. So women tend to be a lot more sort of local focused. So they'll focus on things in the environment that are closer to them, and men tend to focus on more global cues. So they look at the big picture. So that actually might tie into some of these problem solving differences as well. But I figured I'd mention that because here, if we're talking about sort of men having done really well on some of these spatial tasks, it might tie into some of those skills too. But like I said, if we're looking at moving in your environment and here sort of accurately hitting a target that involves spatial as well as body control and fine motor control, this task is looking at can you mentally rotate a figure in three-dimensional space to find a match? They tend to do better at those sorts of tasks. And again, a very oversimplification here with just a couple of examples, but I figured we'd touch on the topic before we move on. Now, towards the end here, I do want to talk about the fact that our intelligence tests are definitely going to be biased. Now, we've said before that there's all sorts of biases in things like the language that's being used. Culture can introduce bias, where if you are sort of having a test designed for one culture taken in another culture, that causes problems as well. So all of those are things that we've already touched on, but I actually wanted to look at sort of different types of biases and sort of what they mean and how we can see them. So first off, I'm going to be hopping between these two slides very quickly, but this was originally coming from a discussion on group differences in intelligence and the bias when we're looking at group differences. This, of course, was first a big issue when we start looking at, say, different cultures, and then it gets tied into the roots of intense racism that underlies a lot of intelligence tests, as well as classism that we talked about at the very beginning. But that's why the title is what it is. But what we are going to care about here is the fact that bias can exist in a couple of different places. What we've focused on mainly so far is the fact that we can have our actual cognitive ability, and then we were trying to quantify it. So if we are trying to capture somebody's cognitive abilities, we're going to get an IQ score that should tell us something about their cognitive ability. We can have bias here called outcome bias. That's specifically saying that our test might, say, underestimate a person's true intellectual ability. So if we have a test where someone being from a different culture or different country ends up sort of reducing their score, not because of their underlying intelligence, but just because of how that test is quantifying their intelligence, then that test has an outcome bias. We can also, though, see that this next step, like I said, we've been doing sort of through ability to our IQ score, how do we quantify it? But we can also try and make use of an IQ score. I think I've mentioned before talking about the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination or something like that. But it's a score that's meant to indicate future performance in grad school. So we have people who will take the test, you get a score, and you submit that as part of your application. Higher scores typically are going to be interpreted as you're going to do better in grad school. If I've mentioned it, then you also know that it is a very not useful test because it is not good at predicting your actual performance. So in that case, we're saying that the score is not useful as a predicted or as a predictive factor. So here they're talking a predicted criterion measure. That would be something like completion of grad school or a number of publications in grad school or something like that. So where does this predictive bias come in? This is going to be a situation where if our test is going to successfully predict some kind of criterion measure, something like performance or success in a particular environment, but it's not equally good across groups. So maybe it does a good job of predicting for one particular type of individual, but not other types of individuals. That would be an instance of bias in this predictive manner. So that's saying that basically this score is going to give us sort of some way of calculating some kind of measure. We think it's going to be really good at this, but we might end up having some groups that end up having sort of a lower measure here. It ends up maybe not explaining their success in the future. Because we've focused so much on sort of this capturing our actual cognitive ability with some kind of score, this is the one that is most important to me. But I just did want to acknowledge that we can actually have issues if we're trying to make use of those scores. This is another reason why, say, schools actually used to get students to take IQ tests during classes, and might even have used those to decide which levels of complexity of classes you might take, but that's not something that's really used any longer. And also that GRE, that's something we aren't really using as much in the future either, because again, not super predictive. But yeah, so I just wanted to mention that this is here as well, though the outcome bias is our big focus. And then finally, to end it all off, I get into our stereotype threat, which I thought I was going to talk about earlier, but here we are. So stereotype threat is an interesting phenomenon in psychology. And this is when our fear of confirming negative beliefs that other groups or other individuals might hold about a group that you belong to actually ends up leading you to have poor performance. So we end up with this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so the example that I have here from a particular study cited is looking at the idea that people think that boys are better at math than girls, or science, if it's a different study. This one was looking at math, but there's always that sort of stereotype that girls aren't as good at math. And so they set this up so that if we have this fear of confirming that negative belief, girls being reminded that girls don't do as well at math, we might actually find that they get stressed when they next take a math test. And because of that stress, their performance is negatively affected. And that's exactly what we end up seeing. So here at the bottom, we're seeing high stereotype threat versus low stereotype threat. All this means is that these groups were told right before they took a test, hey, don't forget that boys are better than girls on math tests. And then here, they didn't remind them of that. And we have both boys and girls measured because we wanted to see sort of is there a difference between the two genders? And then we see that, yeah, this is the number of correct answers, so higher is better. So when the girls are reminded that they're not going to perform as well as the boys, their performance is lower. And then over here, our boys and girls tend to get scores that are fairly close to one another. So we almost see that that reminder reduced performance in one group and might have even enhanced performance in the other group. But we can imagine how important this is, where if there's lots of sort of negative stereotypes floating around, reminding you about how your group might not perform very well, it might actually end up having a physical impact on your performance. So a very interesting phenomena, and I figured I'd mention it here right at the end.